Stencils to be used are made of 3 layers of washi, Japan's special handmade mulberry paper laminated together. Patterns are then transferred to this layered washi for cutting. An additional layer of gauze is then applied with natural lacquer for strength to facilitate the cutting of intricate details in the stencils. For added strength, in a kind of tanning process, kakishubu persimmon juice is brushed onto special paper made for these stencils in the town of Shiroko in the Ise region. 3 layers of this paper are laminated together, dried in sunlight, then smoked over sawdust flame for 3 or 4 days. These stencil papers, known as shibugami, are soaked in water so they are flexible enough to adhere to the fabric, yet they remain very durable. Before cutting, the patterns have been copied to another special paper which is glued to the blank shibugami. Carefully following the patterns, the craftsman cuts the paper stencil, but connecting points called tsuri are left uncut to hold the stencil together. While the stencil still has these tsuri, it is laminated to a supporting layer of paper with all the details positioned correctly. Then the remaining tsuri connecting points are removed. Silk gauze is then glued onto the stencil with lacquer in a process called shabari. Before this coating of lacquer dries, the supporting layer of paper is peeled away and lacquer is applied to the stencil once again. After the second layer of lacquer has dried, the stencil is finally completed. A special resist compound is to be stenciled onto the fabric to prevent the dyes from penetrating areas not meant to be colored. This resist compound is a mixture of special natural pastes which may be adjusted for different dyeing patterns and even according to seasonal room temperatures. For the dyeing of tenugui, the resist compound is made of a very sticky mixture of different seaweeds such as kombu and wakame. Some bentonite clay is later added for body. When dyeing the special fabrics used in traditional yukata summer kimonos, or for komon, the small patterns used on kimono, starch or manori, a mixture of rice powder and bran, is traditionally used. Katatsuke, or placement of the pattern, is the next stage. The resist compound is screened onto areas where the dyes should not penetrate. This katatsuke step is performed on a board known as itaba. The stencil has been soaked in water to be softened and is then stretched and fastened onto a wooden frame with special tacks. The pattern is then squeegeed onto the fabric through the stencil. The resist compound is forced through the stencil to the table. In this way, it is applied to the back of the fabric at the same time. To assure accuracy, several tests may be performed and adjustments made before the real work begins. On the stenciling table, small nails are used as registration pins to ensure perfect alignment as the patterns are applied. A rod is inserted into the roll of blank fabric so the fabric can be easily unrolled along the table. The frame stencil is now lowered to print the patterns. After the first section is complete, the cloth is folded at the edge of the frame. Next, another layer of fabric is unrolled over top of the section just stenciled. In this manner, the resist compound is applied to both sides of the same section of cloth, resulting in one of the most important characteristics of the chusen dye pouring technique. Each side of the cloth will become a perfect mirror image of the other. The patterns must be applied to line up perfectly, so the blank fabric is to be folded very precisely to the exact length of the stencil. This is not so crucial in preparing tenugui because the fabric will be cut on the crease, but for yukata kimono or shirts, the continuity of pattern is critical as the fabric is to be used in its entirety. If the accuracy of the patterns is not perfect, the fabric is considered to be inferior. This stage of the process requires a very high level of craftsmanship. In katatsuke, the smallest inaccuracy in the handwork would destroy the carefully prepared patterns. Each step in this process requires the highest concentration. Even for the most experienced craftsmen, it can be very demanding. Carefully planned patterns can be quickly destroyed by even the simplest incorrect movement. Every gesture must be absolutely precise in order to assure accurate matching of the patterns. The consistency of the resist compound is of particular importance. As the stenciling process is completed, each bolt of the fabric is dusted lightly with sand or sawdust to prevent it from sticking to the next bolt in the pile, known as ishokuzome. The stencil fabric is placed on the dyeing table, the itaba. L-shaped metal bars are placed around the fabric as barriers to stop the dye from running where it is not required. The dye is held in watering cans called yakan, or kettles. To prevent any unevenness in this coloring process, the dye is poured across the fabric from one end to the other. The liquid forces the air out from between the layers of fabric. The dyer then steps on a pedal to start up a vacuum compressor. The vacuum draws the liquid dye down quickly to the bottom of the pile of cloth. Oxidation of the dye is also accelerated through this process. Once the front is finished, the fabric is turned over and the dye is poured generously onto the reverse side in the same way. In creating authentic tenugui, 2 ton of fabric, equal to 24 meters, are dyed at the same time. Each layer produces 20 tenugui, quite a small quantity, but the distinctive and attractive patterns of traditional tenugui can only be achieved in such small batches. There are 2 different types of single-colored dyeing known as ishokuzome. Indigo patterns on a white background and white patterns on indigo. One of the chusen dyeing technique's special characteristics is the ability to dye multiple colors at the same time using a single stencil. This method is called sashiwakezome, or directional dye pouring. In order to prevent colors from flowing where they are not intended, barriers of the resist compound are applied from a tube, similar to a piping bag used in cake decorating. Dyes of each color are slowly and skillfully poured from separate watering cans. After allowing the dye to soak in naturally, the vacuum table is activated again, forcing the dye to penetrate deeply through all layers of the fabric. The oxygen drawn through the dyed fabric also enhances the brilliance of the colors in this technique, sashiwakezome. Another unique characteristic of the chusen dyeing technique is that multiple colors may be poured at the same time. When the background is to be colored, another special method is used. The sections with patterns are dyed first, then these patterns are covered with resist compound. Next, the full background may be colored without dye penetrating the decorated sections. Dyes of different colors are skillfully poured from separate watering cans little by little. The vacuum table is activated here again so that air is suctioned from below, pulling the dye through the fabric. Once the directional dyeing of the patterns is completed, these designs are covered with a resist compound, which blocks and protects the patterns from the next application of dye. Next, the pile of fabric is covered with a cloth so the background may be dyed evenly. Another important characteristic of chusen is the ability to create subtle variation of tone and color. When several colors are poured without any resist blocking, the colors become naturally varied through a technique known as bokashizome, as the dyes soak through the fabric. Highly skilled craftsmanship is required here. Pouring from the watering cans must be handled with extreme sensitivity. Success of such variegated dyeing depends entirely on the craftsman's intuition and control. The degree of variation changes each time. No two pieces are ever exactly alike. In the chusen technique, a gap appears between adjacent colors. Other techniques are required where the design calls for colors of a pattern to line up together.